Welcome to the Blockchain Startup Show with Harrison Wright, a podcast dedicated to dauntless blockchain leaders building our new decentralized future. You'll hear stories, successes, trials, and tribulations as we channel into the lives of high-performing leaders in crypto and Web3. Whether you're currently a Web3 founder or leader, or you one day aspire to be, you'll gain crucial knowledge and insights to accelerate your learning curve, handle this industry's greatest challenges, and make the impact you've always dreamed of.
Hello and welcome to the Blockchain Startup Show. I'm your host, Harrison Wright. I'm delighted to welcome today our special guest, Lorenzo Di Leo. Lorenzo is a veteran of venture building. He's been building startups for over 10 years now, much of that time in Web3. And currently he serves as managing partner at Rocket and also partner at Rayo Capital. And the theme of this show being all about understanding the blueprint for a successful crypto startup and what that looks like. I'm really excited to talk to you, Lorenzo, about your learnings from working with so many teams over the years and the patterns you must have identified. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me, Harrison.
It's my pleasure. Absolutely. There's tons of things I want to dive into, but maybe before we go deep, would you mind giving us just a little potted history, how you came to be involved with startups and then with crypto?
Yeah, sure. Let's say I took my first steps into the startup, the company building world and the tech world back in Spain. I'm from Italy, but I lived in Spain for a bunch of years. And I was part of a company called Arquimia, which was an aerospace company. And I was working on technology transfer projects, meaning finding applications in the real world, let's say in other industries, of the technologies that the company was developing as part of their R&D activities in aerospace, right? So I basically had to invent new products or figuring out new business models so that we could use those very expensive technologies in application with a more massive approach. And so that's when I kind of got into this idea of, okay, well, what is the value proposition? Why would people use this product versus the other product? Or how can we monetize it, right? So that's when I started. It was about, I would say, a little bit over 15 years ago. And then in 2013, I moved to Miami and I met my partners at Rocker. So they had just started Rocker, which is a venture builder, AKA we work with entrepreneurs, we work with investors, we work with corporations, and we help them build new ventures, literally from scratch. So we validate the idea, we put together the team, we build the product, we launch it, we validate it, right? And so we built over 50 tech-based startups over the past 10 years. And so I've been honored to be part of that team and managing a lot of resources, strategies, but also tech people, right? And getting into this company building, right? So as part of Rocker, I then launched the educational vertical. It's called 10XU, with the idea of opening up the methodology and say, hey, instead of hiring me to build your own startups, I can teach you, and then you go out and use what I know, what I learned, the best practices, the methodologies and tools, and you apply it to your own startups. So it was kind of like a way to scale our approach. And so we did that. And then finally we added the accelerators, which is kind of like a hybrid if you think about it. An accelerator means I'm not going to do it for you, but I'm definitely going to work with you in a deeper way compared to just me teaching you how to do it. So I'm going to kind of like be your co-pilot for, let's say, 3 months, and I'm going to co-build your company for a certain amount of time as your co-pilot, if you want. So that's the experience. And then lastly, last year, I started this new venture with Rayo Capital, a project led by Christian Narvaez. And the idea was basically to continue with that, like supporting specifically in the Web3 space, initially with an accelerator and eventually with a VC fund as well.
Fantastic. It's quite a journey.
Quite a journey, a lot of startups that either we build, we accelerated, or I mentor. I literally review hundreds, potentially 1,000 decks every year of startups that, whatever reason, because of one of the accelerators that I run or because of one of the educational programs that I run, they submit their decks to try to get in. I do a lot of training, advising, right? So I'm constantly working with startups and I love it, right? I love it. I love the space. I love the energy, especially in Web3, right? Maybe I forgot to mention that since 2021, I specifically focused on Web3. I did a couple of accelerator programs for the Alground Foundation. I work with the Moonbeam Foundation, and now I'm doing stuff for Rayo Capital. So that was when my involvement in Web3, meaning I was already doing Web3 stuff on my own, but that's when I started to actually work with big clients, large organizations in the space. And that's an amazing journey, right? Because Web3 is such a cool, growing space. So, if you add a growing technology to, the creativity and the energy of startup founders, that's a great mix. So I'm super happy to be in this space.
Yeah, I know we're diverging a little off the topic of founders now, but something I appreciate about working in Web3 is, and I've been a recruiter for over 15 years now, a few different industries. In other industries, most people, even people that are quite good at their job, they kind of see the job as a means to an end for the most part. Not everyone, but fundamentally, I got a little burnout's the right term, but I got a little jaded by recruiting after a while because I was always very idealistic about it. And what I found was eventually I realized 90% of the time what I was doing was finding a guy that hated his job and putting him in another job that he hated slightly less for slightly more money. And then at some point, 6 to 24 months later, he'd be back and have the same problem over again and nothing ever changed. But in crypto, it's not like that. You do get people that hate their jobs and for justifiable reasons, but overwhelmingly people are here because they want to be here. I think it'd be a little bit of an exaggeration to say they'd still be for free. I think sometimes that is true, but there's an energy and a intentionality in the space that's just infectious. And usually in other industries, you mostly only see that in founders and certain employees, but here you see it in pretty much everyone, which is just awesome.
I agree. I think that the feeling of having this mission, we still feel that this is just the beginning. We feel that we're still kind of like creating the industry, and that gives you an additional feeling of being part of it. I usually tell this story, right? When I was a kid, I'm from a small village in Italy. When the first, the internet came to my village, I remember going to my neighbor's house to play with it and stuff. But I was amazed, but at the same time, I was feeling like just a user, right? Like, hey, somebody in the US built this. This is amazing. And now finally we got to play with it. But I didn't feel like I was part of it. I was like, hey, finally I got to play with it, right? As a passive user. But now in Web3, I do feel actively involved in the definition of this space and in the growth of this space. And I think that a lot of people in the space feel the same or share the same feeling, right? So you do feel, hey, this is happening and I'm adding my little grain of sand, let's say. And this is why the feeling of this mission surrounding us is so strong compared to other industries that are much more established that, there are a lot of things have been already discovered. You're just one of many collaborating, right?
Here's a question for you that this brings to mind. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this. I know what I think, but in a space where the quality of the average person is so much higher than most industries and the amount that they care is higher, their expectations and standards are higher. The other interesting thing about working in crypto is a lot of the people that we work with are already financially independent, which is very unusual in any other space. We take it for granted. But what do you think the implications are of all those things for the threshold for success to be a founder and do that successfully?
Well, that's a good point. I don't know if that's completely true in the sense that, you know, at the end of the day, even relatively small improvement still makes a huge impact in the industry, precisely because of the fact that the industry is still growing. And so, yes, on one hand, you have very high expectations because of the quality of your peers, but on the flip side, you know that whatever you're doing eventually is going to be good because it still adds value to the industry. So that's one thing. On the other hand, the other aspect that you mentioned, it's true that it's an industry where you see a lot of people that don't work for money, either because of the vocation or because of the fact that they don't need money. It's true. And I also observe that, especially not only from a development perspective, like tech people, but also from a VC perspective. You see a lot of new investors coming to this space. Uh, I met a few of them, and I'm not judging anybody, but you see a lot of people that are wealthy, maybe because they made good money with crypto, specifically with Bitcoin in the early days. Like they bought Bitcoin very cheap, and now they became wealthy. And so because of that, it's not only that they don't need money, but they also think that just because of the fact that they have money, they are investors, right? And so I saw a few people like getting into the space, say, hey, I want to support this industry that gave me so much. And since I have money, I'm an investor, so I'm going to start to invest in startups. And that's where I'm like, well, yes, you do have money, but that doesn't make you an investor necessarily. I mean, you are technically investing in startups. So yes, you are technically an investor, but being an investor, being in venture capital means much more than having money and deploying capital in startups. And this is where I think that the fact that there is so much money in this industry somehow creates false positives or false expectations, you know, and so sometimes we forget, like specifically in this example, like the professional aspect of being a professional investor, right? So yeah, there is money, but it's not necessarily a super good thing all the time.
Yeah, I can see that. There's, I've noticed this phenomenon as well, where naming no particular names, raising too much money can actually be a bad thing,
Oh yeah,
because the resources are not used in the best way under constraints.
yeah, 100%. Like the fact that you have access to capital doesn't mean that you need to raise all of that or use all of that, or the fact that you don't need money, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that you can just keep building, which is a third scenario, I would say. So you have the scenario of the investors with a lot of money that is not an investor. You had the startup that has access to too much capital. And then you had the third scenario of somebody that is like naturally wealthy and they don't need to raise money. And because of that, they just focus on building. And sometimes, because of that, they get disconnected, right? They build something that doesn't make any sense because they never had a chance to talk to an investor that might raise some red flags, or because they just keep building without even asking the market, right? Like the fact that you can afford to build doesn't mean that you have to build, right? It's actually a good practice to stop, take a step back, and validate with somebody, with investors or with the market. It's much more important, right? So sometimes when you don't have money, you're forced to do that, and it's actually healthy, right? Because it forces you to look at your business from a different perspective. When you have too much money, sometimes you just forget to do that, right? And you just keep building. But again, maybe that's not the right move, right?
Yeah, 100%. How many, I know this is going to be an impossible question to answer, but if you had to guess, how many startups in Web3 would you say you've worked with now,
I mean,
roughly?
roughly, it depends, right? So from a accelerator perspective, I accelerated over 50 or 60, I think, at this point, specifically focused on Web3, right? We're just talking about Web3. From an advisor perspective, like much more than that. Because sometimes, for example, I collaborate with conferences. When you have the typical startup competition at a conference, and then, they do this recruitment process. They select companies, they go to the conference, they pitch in front of investors sometimes, but then nothing happens. Well, that is because the startups are not bad, but are not prepared to pitch in front of investors. So, last year I got to collaborate with a few conferences to train the teams that got selected to and so what I'm trying to say is that in that case, it's not as deep of an engagement as when I work with companies that we accelerate, because that again means sitting down with them pretty much on a daily basis for 3 months. Uh, but they also gives me a chance to work with many more companies. So we're talking about probably like we are in the hundreds of different types of engagements, right? I don't have but I would say, we're talking about a few hundreds uh, companies that I work with in Web3, again, in different scenarios.
What are the patterns that you've seen? Is it possible for you to lay out, I'm not sure if blueprint is the right word, but is there a matrix of traits and situations you say, yeah, these people are likely to be successful. These people are likely to stumble at this hurdle. What are the patterns that you've seen?
Well, there are definitely some treats, right? It's clearly a $1 million question, right? There's no formula. Otherwise, we will all be like rich and there will be no meaning in venture capital. But you do notice some patterns, as you said, right? So, and it might be not what people tend to think. So, for example, one thing that is, it's not like the typical, the typical thing that people say is you might believe that working with the best founder is always a good thing. Like a lot of people, a lot of VCs say, we're founder focused. We select the best founders. In many cases, you get it you put it, you take it to an extreme in which you don't even care about the idea as long as the founder is good, right? Because people are betting on people, not on ideas. And I like all of that. And it's true. I think that if I had to pick between the quality of a founder and versus the quality of the idea, I would rather pick the founder because ideas, they come and go, they evolve. A lot of things can change. So as long as the founder is good, you can always come up with something that makes sense. That is true. Although, especially in Web3, I saw that sometimes working with the best founders is not necessarily ideal. Like if the founder is too good, that might not mean that it's going to be successful. And this is because the cost of opportunity when you build a startup is very high. Like building a startup is hard. It's, time intensive. It's capital intensive, AKA you're going to work a lot of time. Like you're going to spend a lot of time building and you're not going to make a lot of money unless the startup is successful, which is something that is not going to happen, before the fifth, sixth, seventh, 10th year, right, of execution. So you have a high probability of working super hard for many years, and eventually you're not going to make any money, right? That's the typical scenario, unfortunately. So if you're really good, if you're really brilliant, if you have the best network, if you have the best idea, why would you do that when you can work pretty much anywhere in the world and make a lot of money with much lower risk, right? So what happens is that when a founder is very, very good and not completely dedicated to the startup, the cost of opportunity is a distraction. When things, because at the beginning it's all like, oh, I'm gonna do it. Oh, this is gonna be the biggest thing in the world. But then after a while, when shit hits the fan and you are like depressed and and it's hard and you are having a hard time raising money and all of that, then the cost of opportunity is gonna knock on your door and say, hey, are you sure you want to be miserable when you could be successful doing something else, right? And if you're a really good founder, most likely you have options, you know. And so because of that, what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, you want the right balance between being an amazing founder, but also like being committed and still being hungry, and still being humble and think, okay, I want to do this, but I'm not still like good enough. I need to keep learning. I need to keep experiencing, right? If you're too good, at some point, you might realize this is not worth it, right? And again, specifically in Web3, I did see a few founders that when things got hard in Web3, aka crypto winter and all of that, right? They were like, hey, I could just shut down my Web3 company. Even people that raise money, right? So they started studying Web3, they raised venture capital money, and then things started to be hard because of market conditions, because of whatever. And so they were like, why should I do this when I could just reinvent myself, shut down this company, say bye to my investors, and just raise money in AI, which is now the new big thing. There's a lot of money, everybody's talking about it, right? And I'm not judging anybody because, I think it makes sense. But what I'm trying to say is that I was personally surprised. I was like, hey, this founder is actually super good. What happened? And it's like, cost of opportunity. He was too good for this. He was too good to go through all of the pain, right? And there was an easier path. And so why not, right? So sorry for taking so long. Maybe I'm going around, but I'm just saying there are some, going back to your question, right? There are some patterns, right? And one of them is the quality of the founder, yet careful with that because if the founder is too good, you know, it might not be actually a really good thing. So So, look at founders that are highly motivated, that are good enough, but not maybe like exaggerately good, so that they stay humble. They keep learning, they keep pushing. Um, that's definitely, you know, uh, one thing. And the other thing is this mindset of, as I said before, right, of validating and questioning your own ideas all the time. You know, when you see people that are like, hey, I had this idea, I thought it was great, but don't just trust what I'm saying. Look at the data, boom, that completely changes the conversation. Even if we're talking about super early validation, maybe they still don't have a prototype, but they were able to validate, the problem is real. Hey, there is a decent number of people in the market that is affected by this problem, and I have the data. Just by doing that, it shows the mentality. Hey, these people, like this guy, this founder, you know, he got it. It's not about his idea. It's about data. It's about validating. It's about, showing, data. And so that is also something that you can learn, but in many cases, it's hard to teach people to use data because of their own ego. And so when you see that, that's definitely another tree that I would say, hey, this founder, I don't know if it's going to be super successful, but he has more chances than other founders that are just trying to sell you their $1 million idea, right? I appreciate the passion. I appreciate when founders are super committed. I appreciate it when they come and say, I'm not going to take a no as an answer, all of that. Like, I love it. I want to see the passion in founders, as long as it doesn't go beyond being real and realistic, right? An excess of passion makes you blind. You also need to keep your eye open, look at data, look at validation, listen to what other people are saying, especially experts, especially investors. You don't have to do everything, right? You don't need to listen to your advisors blindly, but you need to keep your eyes open and your mind open, right? So when there's too much passion, sometimes that's not good. Again, I think I'm breaking a couple of the typical things that you hear out there, right? Like you want a brilliant entrepreneur and you want a passionate entrepreneur. Yes and no. That's my answer.
That's it's a really interesting point. If I'm hearing you right, it seems to me that there's a relationship here between ego and founder success. That's actually a tricky balance because they have to have a big enough ego to believe it, to be able to will this thing into reality and do what that takes, but not so much of an ego that they ignore reality, which can be very dangerous.
Exactly. And this is why it's so hard to find good entrepreneurs and it's so hard to build a startup because you need to find that balance and it's more of an art, right, than a science. But it's exactly that. You need both. Everybody's going to tell you you're crazy. This is impossible. You can't do it, right? And so, of course, you can just listen to those people. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any innovation in the world. Of course, you need to push it and show them that they're wrong. Yet, you can't just say again, like, I'm not going to take a no as an answer and just keep doing the same. Okay, don't take a no as an answer, but try to understand why they say no and at least evaluate, hey, is that something that I should take into account or they're full of crap? But at least question yourself, right? So that's kind of like the balance, I would say.
I'm really curious what you think about this from a founder's perspective. A trend that I've noticed in people's career progression, and this isn't specifically about founders, but I think it also applies to founders, is that transition from being an IC, an individual contributor, to being a leader. And sometimes the things that make someone really successful as an IC actually hinder them when it comes to leadership. If you look at the profile of the typical person who excels on their own, whether they're a developer, business developer, doesn't matter. It's usually some combination of work ethic, self-responsibility. They'll do more to make sure it gets done. They'll beat themselves up. If someone else causes a problem, they'll take responsibility for it and fix it themselves. They take everything on their shoulders and they power through. It's not the only model of success as an individual, but I'd say it's a powerful trend. that person gets turned into a manager for the first time, usually because they're really good on their own. So it's like, hey, we'll promote this guy to run the team. Doesn't always work very well, because if you imagine you have a team of 5 people and your response to anything being hard is to lock yourself in your office and work double the hours, all you're going to do is alienate the team, and you're never going to be able to outwork the team because you can't do 5 people's work by yourself. I think, do you see that same thing in founders where, so I think from my observation, a lot of founders, especially in Web3, they haven't run a business before. They haven't run a team before. Sometimes they're brilliant people for one reason or another, but the actual business of being a leader and a founder is new to them. Do you see a trend where founders can do that? They lock themselves in their little box. Hey, no, I'm doing my thing. Where really what they need to be doing is, one analogy I heard one time, and I can't remember from where is it. The entrepreneur should be the chef. Their job is to understand what is the recipe we're building, what ingredients does it require, and what combination. And their role is actually to create that system to allow that thing to take shape, which can be very, very different from trying to do the thing themselves.
I agree 100%, and I actually love the analogy with the chef, because I think I'm gonna use it. I'm gonna steal it from you, because the fact that you are really good at cooking doesn't mean that you're a good chef or that you can run a restaurant, right? You can cook for your family of 3 people, but that doesn't mean that you can feed 2,000 people on a daily basis, right? So I definitely see that. Think about like getting started when you had to be very creative. You don't have the resources to get support, right? You have to do it all by yourself. So imagine that scenario compared to running a company post IPO with 5,000 employees, right? 2 completely different scenarios. Not only the skills that are required to run those 2 jobs are different, but also the personality. There are people that might not even like it, meaning if you are really good at creating things from scratch and then you have to babysit 5,000 employees, you might not like it. It's not only that you're not good at it, that you don't have the experience, but that might not be what you sign up for. And so that is one of the major problems of startups. And I'm exaggerating now, but you can see the same evolution from a solo founder, group of 3 co-founders, and then the first employees, and then 20 employees, and then 100, right? And then in the meantime, you're raising money, meaning you're also like bringing additional responsibility, and you're bringing additional people that at some point are going to ask you questions or even like try to tell you what to do, right? So the dynamics of a startup constantly evolve, and founders might not be good at covering all of those roles throughout the evolution of the startup, either because of lack of skills, lack of ability to evolve, and or personality, right? And me personally, for example, I don't think I will be really good at running a company with 5,000 employees. I don't think it goes well with I like to create. I like to have like a more direct connection. I think I'm good at delegating, as long as I maintain a direct connection with the people I work with. When I start to have like multiple layers of like the boss of the boss of the boss of the boss, and then they report to me, like, I don't think I will be good at that. And it's perfectly fine, but just to say, this is why it's so hard. Right? A lot of people, let's use Mark Zuckerberg as an example, right? He started Facebook in college and now he runs Meta, which is like a multi-billion company, blah, blah. There are not so many Mark Zuckerbergs in the world. Like at some point, like it, your job is going to be so different that you might not be the right person to run the company, or you might not even like it, right? So that's a lot of people struggle to scale because of they don't have the ability to evolve and to change the structure of the organization. So put somebody in place at the right time at the right place. Right?
Something I see, a trend I see repeat itself over and over again in crypto teams. The number of teams that really need a COO but don't know it. There's no operator to tie everything together. You've got a bunch of specialists, but no one who really understands the systems of the business at a core level. And I always find it a really interesting data point if a founder has a self-awareness to either hire a COO or sometimes hire a CEO once they get to a certain point, because that's not their forte anymore.
Exactly. I totally uh, agree. I think it's because they're so busy that they never realize what they need. They just keep doing it, or just because they don't have that experience. They don't even know what a COO is or does. And so they might not even know that there is a solution to their problem, and they think that they had to solve their own problem like they've been doing since the inception of the company. But no, maybe now there is a solution. I think that that's actually when an advisor might make a lot of sense for your startup. I'm an advisor myself, and I work with a lot of advisors at different stages. I'm more focused on idea stage, early stage, like how to go from 0 to 1. Let's say that's kind of like my niche. But and so there is definitely a lot of value in having advisors when you're early stage. But I actually think that having an advisor when you're starting to scale makes a lot of sense, especially if it's an advisor that has experience with large organizations, because they could tell you, hey, you know, you might need a COO, or you might need I don't know, a chief of staff, or you might need to step down. If you want to keep creating new products, maybe you need to focus on that and hire somebody to run operations for you, right? So it's good to maybe bring somebody with that experience, because you might not have that experience, so you might not even understand what you need, right?
I learned something that has really stuck with me. I think it was from Dan Sullivan. It's a really simple phrase. Obviously, there's more than a phrase behind it. There's an entire literature behind this, but it's simply who, not how. Whenever you have a problem, the right question to ask is not how do I solve it? It's who can solve it. And even in my small business of my own, I frequently am now asking that question. I might not be hiring a full-time person, but I'm like, who could I consult to help me with this problem versus trying to figure it all out by myself? It's a much higher leverage way to operate, I think.
I agree, but to be fair, right? Because um, maybe some founders here that are listening are like, yeah, sounds easy when you're, let's say, not a large organization, but we're bigger. But when you're getting started, A, you might not have those connections. B, you might not have the budget to hire somebody. Or C, maybe you have the connections, but people don't want to work with you because you still don't have anything to offer in exchange for it. So what I'm trying to say is that I think that the reality of starting a startup from scratch in many cases creates that mindset, forces you to rely on yourself only, and creates this mindset of say, if there is a problem, you are the one who needs to solve it. And it's hard to make that switch when you get to a point in which your startup actually allows you to rely on external. So what I'm trying to say is that I want to be fair because, uh, because in many cases funders are taken to that situation. Maybe they would appreciate some help early on, but they really don't have access to it, and that's why they shut down, right? Yeah, startups evolve, and founders need to evolve as well. Going back to your original question, what are the things that you want to see in a startup? What are the things that might make you think that they're going to be successful? Well, the ability of the founder to keep learning and to evolve at the pace the startup needs. That's really hard.
Yeah, it is. Well, let me ask you this. If you had to think of a matrix, so on one hand, we've got unsuccessful founders, we've got founders that kind of get by the average founder, let's say, and then the founders that really nail it. What would you say are the key differences between those groups? Whether that's inbuilt traits about the person or things that they do and learn and how they approach things.
Well, so we already covered a couple of things, right? A, ability to evolve. B, this balance between believing in yourself without being stubborn, without letting your ego taking over, right? So those are two kind of like mindset type of features, if you want, or skills. I would say there is at least two more that I can think of. One is, in order to run a successful startup, to build a successful startup, you're going to need a lot of different things. And you might not have all of them, which is perfectly fine. So you can A, learn what you don't know, or B, get some support, maybe co-founders. The earlier you realize what you need and what you don't have, the better. A lot of people, eventually figure it out when it's too late. Oh, for example, I need to raise money. Let me see how I can do it. And it turns out it's too late, because it turns out that you made mistakes and investors are not going to invest because you already, burn all of the money in something that you didn't need, for example. So an investor that comes in now is like, hey, you didn't manage your company properly. You burn all of the money in stupid things. Why should I give you more money? So you can go out and burn more, right? So, at some point you're going to learn, but for certain things, it might be too late. So the more you can learn before it's too late, the higher your chances of making it. And so once you understand what you need, and then you understand what you don't have, that's when you can say, okay, I can learn this, or I need help for that. What type of help? A co-founder or an employee or an advisor, whatever it is. The earlier you had this map out, the less risk, let's say. So what I'm trying to say is that, of course, if you have experience, it's easier. But if you don't have experience, you don't need to build that experience by making mistakes. You can educate yourself and you can get ready, right? And so successful founders are the ones who see the risk before it's too late, so they can get prepared. Oh, I'm going to need money in 6 months. Okay. When the time comes, what do I need to show investors to increase my chances of raising money? Oh, they're going to ask me for ABC. Okay. I'm going to build those assets so that in 6 months, when I do need the money, I have that. That's just an example of saying you don't need to make the mistake to learn how it works. So successful founders had that ability. They build a network before they need it. They build a community before they need it. Typical entrepreneur. I build a product and then I go out and I look for a community of users or clients. If you are not able to build that community, you're dead, because you build a product. You probably spend a lot of time and money building a product, and then you realize that you don't know how to sell it, either because you're not good at it or because nobody wants it. Vice versa, there are entrepreneurs, they go out, they build a community first, which in turn gives them a lot of data, because now you know what these people want. You know if they're willing to pay or not. You know where the pain points are. And once you have the community, you build the product. And guess what? At that point, it's going to be much easier to sell the product. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not very intuitive, but those who are able to build assets before they need them are going to succeed. How do you do it? By learning, by asking other people, by reading, by going through accelerators. So going back to your question, a third thing that I would add to my list of things I would like to see in a startup or in a founder is the ability to understand what you know and what you don't know, and get ready for it. And you're going to make mistakes, yes, but there are a lot of mistakes that you can avoid. And I don't like this when I see founders that are like, I'm just going to do it and see what happens. It might be very painful. And in many cases, you might make mistakes that you're not going to be able to fix. And that's when you're dead, right? So yes, making mistakes is natural. Making mistakes is good because you learn, but try to avoid making mistakes as much as you can, right? I know it sounds silly, but I think we still need to hear that. So that will be my third one.
Have you heard that? Sorry to interrupt you, Lorenzo.
Go for it.
Have you heard that old saying, a smart man learns from his mistakes, but a wise man learns from the mistakes of others?
Yeah, exactly.
Reminds me of that.
Right? Exactly. That's exactly the thing. And again, like being an entrepreneur, being an innovator, being a disruptor, you know, yeah, of course, you're trying to do something that has never been possible before. Yet, there are a lot of entrepreneurs out there, very successful people that you can learn from, right? Yes, you're a disruptor, but you're not inventing venture capital, you know, like you don't need to reinvent the wheel from scratch. So yeah, pick your battles, I would say, and don't be too proud and get help if you can. So again, going back to your question, there are founders that have that mindset and they show it, very early on. Even like companies that we select for our accelerators, the accelerator for me is a great opportunity to observe founders very closely. Especially, for example, if you're an investor, if you're a VC, I definitely recommend VCs to partner up with accelerators because instead of having a due diligence based on a couple of calls and maybe looking at some reports or whatever, you know, imagine if you had a chance to observe how the startup works for 3 months. How much depth can you get? How much data points can you get? So that's exactly what an accelerator is. It's like a pilot of the startup, of running the startup before you actually get to run the startups for real, right? And so eh, going back to what I was saying, right? So even with the companies that we accelerate, during the accelerator, you quickly see who the good ones are gonna be eventually. Because upfront, when we select the teams, we try to figure out who has the best team and the best idea and this and that. But when you really realize who the good ones are going to be, is during the accelerator because you see them in action and you, for example, throw them some feedback and you see what they do with the feedback. And what I always tell my company is like, you don't have to blindly implement what we're telling you because we're just like advisors. And you might find advisors with different opinions, and it's fine. That's actually why it's so hard to be a founder, right? Because you're going to hear a lot of different opinions. And eventually, you are the one who needs to make a decision because you are the one who's going to pay for the consequence, right? But going back to what I was saying, like, we give them a lot of feedback. They don't need to implement blindly what we're saying, but they need at least to show that they're processing the feedback and they're eventually making a real decision, like a decision based on something. Hey, I thought about what you said. I researched. I think you're right. I'm going to do it. Or, hey, I thought about what you said. I don't think you're right because of ABC, so I'm not going to do it. Perfect. But at least I want you to show me that not only that you appreciate the feedback, but that you're, making good use of it. Versus there are a lot of other companies that maybe go through the accelerator because of the recognition, because of the upfront investment that in many cases we make, right? And then they don't really care about anything else. Well, I can tell you, I'm not getting offended because you're not paying attention to my feedback. I don't really care. I'm just observing and I'm saying that's not a good founder. That's somebody that is not able to appreciate, the support and they're not going to change. That's their DNA. So yeah, maybe you have a super cool project. You're not gonna go far with that mindset, right? So yeah, that's another thing. And let me ask you, just so again, like I try to be fair because I don't want startups to feel that I'm judging them or anything. There's also a fourth ingredient that we should mention, which is luck. Like, sorry, because it feels like it goes against what I'm saying. I run accelerator for a living, right? So I'm supposed to be the one saying, hey, there is a science, there is a methodology. It's all true, but there is also like a little bit of luck. The luck of building the right thing at the right time. And this is very relevant in Web3, where the market moves with like crazy cycle, you know. Unfortunately, I work with some startups in this past cycle that honestly, I'm completely like, I'm sure that the same company, the same founder, even the same idea, if you want, but most importantly, the same founding team in a different, market cycle would have obtained much better results, right? So I don't know if it's luck, if they pick the right timing, or maybe, you know, it's very hard to predict, but that's also another component. And vice versa, there are companies that are raising money easily, for example, which is one of the potential reasons of success, because they're supported by a better environment, better timing, better market condition, better ecosystem. I definitely think that nowadays you can build a successful startups from anywhere in the world, from Argentina, from Africa, from wherever. Like, I think nowadays, especially in something like Web3, there's no excuses. Yet, it's still true that in some cases, being part of a bigger ecosystem helps because, like here in Miami, for example, which is not even the biggest ecosystem for startups in the world, but it's a strong one, right? Like, even if you don't want to, there are events every day, startup meetup groups, conferences, summits, even just like happy hour of the Miami tech community, for example. Like, even if you don't want to, you end up talking with founders, you end up talking about your project or listening to other people's idea. Clearly, it's much harder if you come from a small village in the middle of nowhere. You still have access to all of the things, but you need to be much more proactive, right? You need to look for resources online, or you have to whatever, right? So again, I don't want to say it's all about luck, but I do want to add that ingredient to this conversation because you can make your own luck, yes, but it's still a factor, right?
There's a couple interesting things that you mentioned in all of that that I wanted to pick up on. One is that, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in 2021, I'm being a little bit facetious, but you could almost rock up the VC with like a little sheet of paper and you just write on it. It's like Uber, but on blockchain. So here, yeah, sure, take $10 million. But last year, Series A funding was so hard to come by in particular. And there's a lot of good projects that they hadn't reached the point of being able to be self-sufficient yet, but they also can't raise. What are they going to do? And that is a major factor. I also think, I don't know if we're going to go back to how it was in 2021 again, but I think with the interest rates and the way funding is working now, I think there's an argument to be made that it's actually healthier because you had teams just raising more and more money without any path to revenue or self-sustainability. Whereas, you're looking at this framework of getting data like we were talking about. Okay, so you have a thesis, you build, but you get a community, you get an audience. Does it resonate? Does it work? What does the data tell us? Okay, well, we should build that, should be working towards something that creates revenue, or sometimes we can't necessarily measure things in direct revenue in cryptos or whatever the closest equivalent is, in a way that makes that project self-sufficient. They don't need to rely on funding anymore. So now I think the zero interest rate phenomenon is, hey, you see it in Web2 as well. We just build to raise more and more money. The objective should be to build something that actually solves a market need and therefore doesn't need to continue raising money, other than they use that money to scale a model that they know works and to fuel it, not to keep trying to find something that works just indefinitely. So I think that's very interesting.
Because what you said is really right. But on the flip side, sometimes we forget that, from the outside, when you see like companies raising a lot of money, we think that it's because they're greedy. We think that it's because they're out of their mind, or we think that it's because they want to scale, too fast. And in many cases, that's true. In many cases, there is a big speculation effect, a speculation component behind it. But to be fair, in some cases, those founders are forced to do that just because of how venture capital works. What I'm trying to say is that in a perfect world, you would raise just the right amount of money, enough to achieve your goals, but not too much so you don't get diluted and you don't add too much risk to your company. But in other cases, you're forced to raise a lot of money, A, because your competitors are raising a lot of money and you're competing, or B, which is probably related to what I just said, because you cannot grow at your own pace. You need to grow as fast as possible because the market in which you are is growing. And if you just grow organically, you're going to lose your competitive advantage and you're going to stay behind. Right. So, there are companies that might not even need to raise money because they might be like, imagine like an e-commerce platform. You make revenue almost by definition from day one. Right. Yet you might have to raise money because it's so competitive that you need to build a competitive advantage. You need to stay relevant. So what I'm trying to say is that what people don't understand when they have zero exposure to venture capital, like a lot of startups that I work with, they have never raised money. So they have bad misconceptions about raising money. They think that it's like a grant. Somebody likes you, so they're going to give you money. No, it's a business proposition, right? If they give you money, it's because they're expecting something in exchange. So don't be silly. A. B, they think I need to raise as much money as possible. No, raising a lot of money might be bad for your company. It adds a lot of responsibility. It dilutes you. You might end up with not enough equity to keep the motivation alive, and many more things. Right? But on the flip side, there are some rules. And this is why you see people doing crazy things just because this is how venture capital works. And either you play the game with the real rules or you're out. And unfortunately, that's how it works.
That's a really interesting angle I hadn't considered. Thanks for that. I've got one last question for you. Imagine someone is listening to this who has been a successful founder in Web2. What would your advice be to them if they're considering starting a company in Web3? What I'm really curious about is you've straddled both areas, right? So what are the key differences that someone should consider to found a crypto project versus, say, a SaaS company or a traditional Web2 model?
That's a good question. Clearly, I'm going to hyper generalize it here, right? Like, so clearly there are many, many different scenarios, but just to simplify it a little bit, I think that the typical Web3 founder is a little bit naive from a business perspective, meaning the people who are building in Web3, typically they know a lot about Web3, a lot about blockchain or crypto, but statistically speaking, they might not know, let me say, anything about a value proposition, a business plan, raising money, and all of that. Versus in Web2, the typical founder might know a little bit more about those things, like comparing the typical Web3 founders to the typical Web2 founder. So in Web3, usually they know a lot about blockchain and very little about business, which is why I think that, what we're doing, for example, with the accelerator makes a lot of sense because that's exactly, how we can help those funders. But that's the reality. On the flip side, somebody that has a lot of experience in Web2, as you said, maybe some successful funders, maybe somebody who's running a SaaS company or whatever. Again, generalizing, there are a lot of funders that probably are getting into Web3 for the wrong reason. Some of them might not even need the blockchain, but they want to add this blockchain thing, because it's cool. So it's kind of like a marketing thing, like maybe not so much now, but like last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you saw a lot of companies doing that. Just putting blockchain on their website because it's cool. And because there's this idea that blockchain means transparency, blockchain means security, right? So if I say that I build this on the blockchain, it's kind of like a marketing thing. So unfortunately, a lot of Web2 founders are building on Web3 A, for the wrong reason, or B, because they really have a misconception of what the blockchain can and cannot do. So that's kind of like my advice. I think you don't need to go crazy. The blockchain is a technology. It's not the solution to all of your problems. It's a goal. It's how you get there. And so, if you come from Web2, I think you should look at the blockchain as one of the many options that you have from a tech perspective to solve your problem. But what is your real problem? What is the solution that you're providing to your client? Now, if the blockchain adds value because it allows you to do things that were not possible in Web2 without the blockchain, then go for it. But if the blockchain aspect is just like a cool thing to say or a cool thing to have, or or I like crypto or I like Bitcoin, so I want to do a Web3 project, those are not the right motivation. And I think that with this cycle, we got rid of a lot of those projects, like a lot of projects that were using the blockchain for no reason. And vice versa, we saw many more projects that are using the blockchain for very meaningful applications, meaning solving problems that couldn't be solved without the blockchain, right? So I think that we're getting to that point, and I'm excited about it. But that's a typical Web2 founder that comes and say, "Hey, I was thinking about, adding the blockchain to my project. What do you think about it?" Like, I don't know. You tell me. You need it. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Can you solve it without the blockchain? Like so. So yeah, sometimes they are very naive in that sense. But hey, it's part of the learning curve, I guess, right?
Thankfully, that we've been spared a little bit on that in this past year now compared to the past, because all those people are now, hey, how can I add ChatGPT to my company? Oh, we need AI. Oh, I'm an AI expert now. Yeah. But so I guess my last follow-on question is, assuming they're getting into Web3 for the right reasons, these, prior Web2 founders, what would you say are the top 3 things they should learn or upskill in to be successful in Web3 as they were in Web2 in general?
Well, so you need to understand the potential of the blockchain, but you also need to understand the limitations. There are current limitations, right? I'm a huge fan. I'm super bullish on blockchain and Web3. Like, I had no doubts that we're gonna see more and more blockchain applications in our life. Yet currently there are still limitations. For example, usability, right? So yeah, maybe using the blockchain. I was looking at some like social media apps, no names, where social media is not a big thing on blockchain or decentralized network in general, right? So now you have these decentralized social media platforms, and I'm personally super excited about it. Like, the concept makes so much sense. Yet, if you really do it on chain, I haven't seen anybody solving the usability problem. Like, just to create your user, you need to go through XYZ amount of steps that are still a huge barrier for most of users out there. If you're not familiar with Web3, you're going to have a hard time, for example, creating a user in one of those social media decentralized platforms, right? So just to use it as an example, can blockchain add tremendous value to social media? 100%. Blockchain will enable you to do things that are imaginable on, social media as of today, in Web2 social media. Yet, you need to understand that there are some limitations or some barriers. For example, usability. And this is something that, in Web2, you might not think about those things. In Web2, we're not used to think about it. Yeah, there is always like improvements in UX UI, but we don't have that problem. Like, if you come up with an app, people will know how to download it, how to sign up. Like, people will have no issue accessing your app, not using it, but accessing. In Web3, you have to have that. So, number one, if you come to Web3, the potential is huge, but be realistic with the limitations. Like, you need to be aware of them and figure out how to, bypass them or solve them. That's number one. Number two, in Web2, unless you're doing something like very specific, like insurance or big financial things, usually regulations are not a big thing. in Web3, you need to know what you're doing and what's the situation with regulation. Like, don't be naive. You might think, hey, this is just a stupid token. Hey, it's not harming anybody. Hey, this is just like a reward program. Nope. You might get in trouble for that, right? So you need to know the rules before you play the game. And unfortunately, in Web3, the rules are not even clear. In Web2, you might not have to think about all of those things. In Web3, it is a conversation you need to have at some point. And you might want to get that professional advice just to make sure that you're not doing anything wrong or anything that is not wrong today, but might be considered wrong at some point if the regulation changes, for example. So that's the other aspect. And the third aspect is well, we already say that you need to use technology for the real value. Well, the third aspect is, maybe getting access to experts in Web3, even if it's improving, the community is getting bigger and bigger, might still be a challenge compared to Web2. If you need an engineer, there are dozens of platforms where you can find talent, hire talent remotely, stuff on demand. In Web3, there are not so many resources yet, and there is a lot of crap out there because this is so new that it's hard for some engineers, for example, to really show that they're good for real, right? There is a lot of people saying, yeah, I'm super experienced in smart contracts and this and that, and maybe it turns out that you're not, right? So yeah, that's also another thing. A lot of 75% of building a Web3 startup is exactly like building a Web2 startups. Again, validating things, raising money, it's exactly the same thing. Like, don't think that Web3 is that different. But for the 25% that is different, you might need help, and it might still be challenging to find the right resources. It might be a little harder than what you're used to in Web2. So yeah, those might be my three things. This is hard, Harrison, because I didn't prepare for this, so I really tried to give you my best answers. I'm sure that if I could think about it, I could come up with like 20 more reasons, but I hope this is helpful.
No, it is helpful. Actually, it's some really, really great insights here, and I've really appreciated it a lot. I think our listeners will as well. Lorenzo, it's been really a pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming on. I am putting you on the spot here again, but any final words of wisdom for our intrepid founders or aspiring founders?
I definitely encourage anybody to consider being an entrepreneur. Not everybody is born to be an entrepreneur. You might not have the right personality, the right risk appetite, but it's definitely something that you might want to consider because maybe you haven't thought about it and you will be great. It's very hard. The chances of succeeding, at least in your first entrepreneur journey, are very low. 90% of startups fail within 2 years, right? So don't be silly. Understand what you're doing, be prepared. Yet it's an amazing path, right? And you can ask all of the entrepreneurs that I met in my career, even the ones who are not successful yet, but might be successful in the future. Nobody regrets it. And it's because it's really like an amazing journey. So yeah, don't be naive. Don't be egocentric. Learn, listen, keep your mind open, but definitely consider being an entrepreneur. And specifically, Web3 is our chance, guys. It's our generation chance. I think that it's an industry, it's a market that is being built right in front of us right now. And we have a generational opportunity to be part of that. So go for it.
Would agree with that sentiment. And you could argue that being an entrepreneur is the ultimate vehicle for self-actualization, but that's veering way into philosophical territory. And that could be a whole nother episode in itself. So I'll just park that thought there for
Yeah.
now. Lorenzo, thank you so much for coming on. If someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Look for me on LinkedIn with my name and last name, Lorenzo De Leo. LinkedIn might be the easiest. It's where I'm active. Or I do Twitter as well. I think that would be better than email. So yeah, please reach out, say hi, and I'm always happy to network with smart people.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Harrison. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for listening. This has been the Blockchain Startup Show with Lorenzo De Leo, and we will see you next week. Talk soon.